look like a spy, you know. I get that almost every time I speak before an audience like this, and you know, I have to clarify that I was an analyst, sort of like a glorified political scientist and reporter and journalist. I didn't overthrow any governments. I didn't torture anybody. So it may be a little bit of a stretch for you, but if I don't look like a spy, because that's probably because I'm not choreographed, or I'm not the sort of quintessential representative of that kind of craft. Thanks for the coffee. One other thing, just I mentioned all these languages. I was being introduced by a friend from the Veterans for Peace, a rather big gathering. It was really nice. Nice introduction, almost as nice as the one I just got. And he ended it by saying, and he speaks Russian. And I burst out laughing. And he looked at me and he says, don't you speak Russian? I said, yeah, Bill, it's a pejorative in my family. He said, what pejorative? Yeah, well, look, I can't hang a picture right. I can't screw a light bulb in. And so my younger children, they always say, well, yeah, but at least he speaks Russian. He can speak Russian. Did you know that? He can speak Russian. So it's a real downer, sort of like a put down. I can't do anything else, certainly not around the house, but I can speak Russian. Okay? Oh, let's get to it here. What I'm going to do here is adduce some facts. And I like to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a previous senator from this great state of New York, who said famously, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. So what I have here, what I'll present to you are facts, documented facts. We can discuss them later, and if you have different facts, I'd love to hear them. We'll have ample time for questions and answers. I want to start out with a little keynote from my patron, my patron saint, whose name is George Kennan. Some of you know that George Kennan was the ambassador to Russia, and he was the author of what we decided to call the containment policy, where the Soviet Union expanded in Eastern Europe, and Kennan devised a strategy to contain them. He had a different view when it came to expanding NATO after the Soviet Union fell apart. And I have his quote here, which I'll just read to you because I can't pick it out from this menage. Here it is, I think. Well, what he said was, look, if we enlarge NATO after the Soviet Union fell apart, that's the most disastrous mistake U.S. foreign policy can make since the Cold War ended. Okay. Now, I think the facts that I'm about to show you will sort of illustrate that. First, I just want to talk about the strategic, the broad picture. And I have a slide here. May we have the first slide? The first slide will show various key events here that show how the Ukraine thing really got started. Okay, now, is it up?
Yes.
Okay.
You have to push the icon so it's full screen.
See it now?
Yes.
Okay, so fall of the Berlin Wall, 89. Russia fell apart shortly thereafter. Now, how do we get one back? There we go, okay. There was a deal in February 1990. It is indisputed, and it's documentary evidence of it in the George Washington University archives, there was a deal between the U.S. and Russia, no NATO enlargement in return for a reunited Germany. Now, those of you who know something about World War II, during which I was alive the entire time, know that the Russians lost 26 million plus. Think about that, folks. 26 million plus in World War II. We, the United States, suffered maybe 420,000 folks, military folks. So this was sort of a bitter pill for the Russians, you know. A reunited Germany? Well, Jim Baker, our Secretary of State, was a smart lawyer from Texas, and he said, now, Gorbachev, how would it be if we promised not to move NATO 1 inch to the east? Well, long story short, they bought that. That was the deal. They reneged. Now, in February 2008, our ambassador in Moscow, his name is Bill Burns, he is now head of the CIA, he was told by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, look, if you try to include Ukraine in NATO, you will provoke us. We will have to decide whether we'll have to invade Ukraine because there was sure there will be a civil war, and we have to make that painful decision as to whether we have to intervene. Niet means niet was the name. Well, niet means niet. Russian reaction to NATO enlargement was the title of the cable he sent back. And it was pretty matter of fact. It pointed out, look, you know, the Russians are really neuralgic about this. And, you know, from a strategic point of view, you know, it's possible to understand why they're so neuralgic. Well, he didn't get to first base with Dick Cheney and George Bush. And so 2 months later, NATO in its wisdom decided Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. That was key. As a codicil here, Bill Burns has forgot about that. Now he says what Putin did in Ukraine was unprovoked. The CIA director should not become a propagandist for the government, the more so since he's become a cabinet member. He knows it was provoked. It's in this cable from Moscow. If I've seen one Moscow cable, Embassy Moscow, I've seen thousands of them in my job as chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch. It's genuine. We have it. How do we have it? Thank you, Julian Assange. It was part of the WikiLeaks disclosures. It's genuine. It's there. And it's on the record. Now, no Ukraine in NATO. That's what Bill Burns was told in 2008. There's something I forgot to include here. The next one is there was a coup in Kiev, orchestrated by the West. It was the most blatant coup in history. It's the only coup that I know that was advertised 2.5 weeks before the coup on YouTube. I'm not going to go into that, but there was an intercepted conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, a U.S. ambassador in Kiev. They were plotting the coup to the degree of naming who would take over which posts. As soon as those coup leaders came in, they said, now we're going to join NATO, and now we're going to ban Russian as a official language. So that should be the number 4 entry here. Number 5, December 2021. Well, the Russians offered a draft treaty saying, look, we're really concerned about strategic situation, especially if you intend to embrace NATO. And so, look, here's a treaty. Why don't we talk about this? And the U.S., as you'll see a little bit later, said no. The only other thing that should be included here is that in April 2022 now, there was an agreement to cease fire, an agreement to make Ukraine neutral, an agreement to end all this stuff. It was initialed. We have the Turkish foreign minister and a former prime minister of Israel attesting to this. They played middlemen roles, okay? It was concluded on the 31st of March 2022, and it was rejected by the United States and Zelensky on, well, the next week, because the U.S. and British said, you may want to deal with the Russians that way for a ceasefire or neutrality. We don't. Better reject it. That's an important point. I mentioned it again because Aaron Mattei mentioned it in his last lecture here, but it's worth underscoring. So, how do we know about Boris Johnson from London coming over to put the kibosh on that treaty? Ukrainskaya Pravda, that's the official voice of Kiev. It's really laid out there pretty well. Now I want to get a little more granular, okay? We talked about one neuralgic issue for the Russians. Now I want to talk more specifically about a specific thing that most Americans don't know word one about. It has to do with the fact that we have missile emplacements in Romania and in Poland. That is, U.S. missile emplacements in Romania and Poland. How many of you know that? Raise your hand. Okay, very few, okay? Well, let me explain. After the coup in Kiev in February 2014, and then after Crimea was annexed by Russia, Putin made a very important speech. It was it was April of 2014, and what he said is, look, we didn't want NATO enlargement to include Ukraine, but, quote, even more important, end quote, was the danger of having offensive strike missiles put in Crimea. So this is 2014, folks. What I'm going to talk about now very briefly are offensive strike missiles. Already, the emplacements already there in Romania and in Poland. You can't see what's in those canisters because they're capped, okay? So you can't tell whether they're ABM missiles, whether they're cruise missiles, offensive missiles, or whether they eventually become hypersonic missiles. Now, hypersonic, what does that mean? Some of you have the same color hair I do. Remember Mach 1? Wow! What was Mach 1? Anybody? Speed of sound, man! Would you believe that these hypersonic missiles go at the speed 8, 9, 10 times the speed of sound, and there is no defense against them? The Russians have been using them in Ukraine. They are capable, additionally, of having nuclear warheads, but of course those haven't been used. So let me have the next slide, please. Do we have December 21? We do, okay. Putin, when we rejected the NATO treaty, when we in NATO rejected even talking about the draft treaty that the Russians gave us in mid-December, Putin spoke to his senior military folks, and he was really, really upset. And he said, look, you know, we're in a pretty tough situation. U.S. missile sites already in Romania and Poland can launch offensive strike missiles. If hypersonic, 5 minutes to target. So here's Putin thinking, I will have 5 minutes to decide whether I want to destroy the rest of the world. 5 minutes, that much time, okay? Now, the key is, in this speech, very big speech, angry speech, he says, quote, the U.S. will give hypersonic weapons to Ukraine, end quote. Wow. Well, I don't know what happened after December 21st, but the Russians called the White House on the 30th of December and said, Mr. Putin would really like to talk to Mr. Biden like now. And they were flummoxed. I mean, they said, well, wait a second, our negotiators are going to meet in Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January. You know, why now? I said, please, please. Now, to his credit, Biden took the call, and the readout of the call said, Washington has no intention to deploy offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Whoa. I'm sorry. Yeah, in Ukraine. Now, there was great rejoicing in Moscow the next day. New Year's Eve was never so happy. this touched on fully 5 of the 8 provisions in the draft treaty that the Russians had presented to NATO and to the U.S. Of course, we did not sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to never enlarge NATO. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent NATO enlarging more NATO close to his borders, and he got just the opposite. Look, Finland's part of NATO now. Maybe Ukraine will be part of NATO. Ha ha ha. He wanted us to sign an agreement to prevent the enlargement of NATO, and he got just the opposite. Ha ha ha. Now, that's not a ha ha, guys. This is an existential threat to Russia, and when people say that, they have to kind of stick to the facts. Now, as I said before, up until just 5 weeks ago, if you said that Putin invaded Ukraine for any other reason than that he wanted to take over Eastern Europe and maybe waltz right to the west, that was the reason adduced. Of course, he's an imperialist. He wants to expand Russia. Well, if you've been told that, then these facts kind of jar, because what Stoltenberg is saying is, no, all they wanted us to do is not incorporate Ukraine into NATO, and instead of that, we rejected that proposal, and now he's got still more. He's got Finland, Okay, now to finish on a slightly more jocular note, this is kind of dreary material, isn't it? I want to show you, I don't know who concocted this. If we could have that last view graph now. It's kind of this person who put this this little video together, and it's only 1 minute. It's the title is Not About NATO, okay? And it's only 1 minute, so if you fall asleep, you're going to miss the whole thing, and it's on the final, okay? Hear that in the back there? It's on the final, okay? If we could do this last one here and make sure the volume is okay.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy.
Okay, this goes on, and I suggest you look at it, but I don't want to overstep my time here. I'm really interested in Q&A and challenges, or other facts, or whatever. But this is serious stuff, folks. We're faced with not only a Russia that has been really thinking that it has to move to defend its strategic interests, but worse still, and I'll stop with this. We have driven Russia into China's arms. There used to be a triangular relationship, okay? Russia, China, the United States. It used to be sort of like an equilateral triangle, if those, so you have that. Okay, now it's a isosceles triangle, okay? And the U.S. is on the short end of the stick. Even Kissinger, even Brzezinski said the worst thing you can do is get both Russia and China together against you. I mean, it just makes common sense. Now, when Putin was asked about this at Valdai, this discussion club, this was October of last year, October 27th. You can look it up. Questioner, Mr. Putin, Mr. President, The U.S. is taking China on at the same time it's taking us on in Ukraine. How do you explain that? And Putin looks and he says, well, you know, it's a good question. Initially, I thought there must be some subtle plan here, but I no longer think so. I think they're crazy. I think this is due to arrogance and a feeling of impunity, period, end quote. Now, I happen to agree with what Putin just said, or the quote I just made, but it doesn't matter a rat's patootie what McGovern thinks. If Putin thinks that, that's really serious. And every indication I have is that China and Russia are joined at the hip now. They've pretty much recruited places like Iran, Brazil, and others in a political sense to stand with them. So if people tell you that Russia has been isolated by what happened in Ukraine, that's not quite true. It's kind of mischievous because what you have is listen up now, this is on the test, okay? What you have now is the lily white West arrayed against the rest of the world, 80% of which are people of color. It's a very unhealthy situation. And of course, you've had the Ukrainians accusing the Russians of being subhuman people of color. So I hate to end on this unhappy note. I have a couple of jokes in my head here I could tell later, but let's end on that and treat it with the seriousness that it deserves. I'm happy to entertain any comments or questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. That's great. Wonderfully provocative. I'm sure lots of comments and questions. But before we open things up, Professor Carolyn Eisenberg will share some insights and comments, and then we will look to all of you for your reactions and insights. With the cords there.
I'll get the screen out.
Sad way to die. At a Hofstra podium. Not good. I have a feeling that probably people would rather ask questions of Ray than have another long talk that will be almost as depressing as the talk he just gave. So I just want to say a couple of things which are a bit disconnected. One is that most of this talk focused on how did we get to this place, right? How did this happen? But part of what we're now faced with is that Russia has invaded Ukraine. And the newspapers for months, right, have been having stories about all the horrible things the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And very reasonable people feel like that's really terrible. And that whatever the reason, that their behavior is criminal. And so that's come to really define the situation. Is not so much, how did we get to this place, but really, what are the Russians doing in Ukraine? And that has really shaped the conversation. And so one of the questions that I want to ask Ray towards the end of my remarks is really just how do we go from there to an actual solution to this problem? What would a solution actually look like? I hadn't planned to do this, but in my other life, the first book that I wrote is called Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany. And an important part of that book is actually about NATO. So I just want to take a couple minutes just on that. It's been my experience as a professor that the minute I start talking about NATO, everybody goes to sleep. And I was like, how can I make this interesting to people? And partly people go to sleep because there's kind of a received wisdom about NATO, right? Which is, what is NATO? It's a Western military alliance. Why does NATO exist? It exists to prevent aggressors, or in this instance, the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, from invading Western Europe. And almost always when I say this, I might ask the question in my classes, which I try not to do too often, about how did NATO ever get born? The usual answer is, well, the Russians had created a military alliance, and it was very aggressive, and so the West needed to respond. Is usually the answer. So I could talk about this now for 10 hours, but that understanding of the old NATO as it's not controversial, it's not interesting, we all agree about it, we love it, I think it's wrong. And one of the surprise little itty-bitty facts is, which always surprises my classes, is that actually the Russians didn't create a military alliance in Europe until 6 years later. 6 years later. And NATO came into existence for complex reasons, which I won't go into except to say this, that at the time that NATO was created, it was controversial. It wasn't just a snore, like all reasonable people agree that NATO is wonderful. It was controversial. Why was it controversial? One reason is because the Russians had not created a military alliance. So people were saying at the time, and I'm not saying that's a majority, but this is the controversy, why are we creating a military alliance when the Russians haven't done so, and isn't that a provocation? A second reason that it was controversial, and I do think this has relevance to the present, is that contrary to what many of us were trained to think, there was an Iron Curtain in Europe, that all of Eastern Europe was already gone under Russian tyranny, that the only issue was preventing that tyranny from going to other places. That wasn't true. That Europe was not divided in the way that it became. The Soviet Union was dominating certain East European countries. There's no question about that. But they weren't dominating all of them. They weren't even dominating East Germany or Berlin. That in these places there were still political parties that were operating, that were independent. There were still labor unions that were operating, that were not communist unions. There were still in many of these places a free press that was continuing to operate. So it really depended on which country you were actually looking at. It wasn't like there's just one truth. And so one of the concerns that people were raising, which will never appear in your history books, but was certainly, when I probably spent as much time as Ray reading secret documents, was that if you are going to create a military alliance in Europe, it's provocative. It's not just defensive. It's, we can all agree that we don't want Russian troops marching into France. This is not controversial. But that if we're creating it now, where there's still some pluralism in Eastern Europe, when a Russian military alliance hasn't yet come into existence, we're going to propel things in a direction that will ultimately be the exact opposite of what we want. And so even back then, and I'm talking now about 1949, George Kennan, who Ray was just talking about, who is the father of containment and who, was really a Cold Warrior. But by the time he got to 1949, George Kennan was warning against NATO. And again, it wasn't because he was some crazy peacenik. It was really because he was saying that that could be provocative, that the situation in Eastern Europe could get a great deal worse, that military tensions that did not exist would come into existence. So that was really the argument. And I'm recognizing that the discussion that Ray McGovern has presented today is about a very complicated and tangled issue, and I have some reservations about taking us back to 1949. But I think that there's a relevance of that past experience in now, which is that the decision to extend an American-led military alliance is not an unalloyed good. It doesn't just make everybody safe and happy. It can make some people feel safe, some nations feel reassured. Right now, given Russian behavior, the Swedes and the Finns, are thinking, give me NATO, I need that protection. But we want to make sure not to confuse the effects with the causes, and not to take steps that actually make bad situations worse. And it is...
So this was a big deal. This was sort of a promise in the nature of the promise made in February 1990 not to move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened? Next slide, please. Oh, wow. February 12th, 22. So we're talking just, 6 weeks later, huh? Okay. Next talk, and the most recent and probably the last talk between Putin and Biden, the readout. The U.S. gave no meaningful response on the two cardinal issues, enlargement of NATO and deployment of strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, just to put this in the context of what was going on in the ground, on February 16th, there was an exponential rise in the army shelling, the Ukrainian army shelling of the Russian-speaking area of Donbass. Next slide, please. Do we have a bar graph? We do. Is the bar graph? Now it is, okay. So now this is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, nonpartisan. They had monitors on the ground, okay? I don't know if you can see those little numbers at the bottom, but on the 14th of February, there were 50 shellings by Ukrainian forces on the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass. On the 16th, there were, looks like, 300. Go up to 21st, 22nd of February, over 1,400. I mention this because it's not widely known in the West. These facts are indisputable. As I say, they come from monitors on the ground. And during all this, of course, on that first line under Donbass, you see that the bulk of the Ukrainian army was massed near Donbass. Next slide, please. Do we have Putin? Kiev, okay. So this is what Putin said on the 21st of February now, right before the invasion. Kiev is launching a blitzkrieg. Now, the Russians know what blitzkrieg is, as few other countries know. Against 4 million Russian speakers, Russia then recognizes the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk in the Donbass. They invoke the treaties that had been signed with Russia, and on the 24th, as most of you know, Putin sends the troops into Ukraine, okay? He sends them in there, and he cites Article 51 of the UN Charter. Now, some of you may be able to talk to that and to the legalities of that. I'll not dwell on that here, but suffice it to say, when I asked Richard Falk this question, he said, Ray, this is unsettled law. There are huge disputes on Article 51 and how it applies. So it's not automatically illegal, much less unprovoked. Now, I want to switch gears just for a second and talk about these offensive strike missiles again in Romania and Poland. May we have the next slide, please? It should be a map. Oh, good, right up there. Okay. Now, I put in the distance between Washington, D.C. and Boston just for illustrative purposes, 640 kilometers. Now, you can see the bases in Romania on the bottom. A generic ballistic missile would take now about 10 minutes to get to Moscow or to the western part of Russia where the ICBM forces are. From Poland, it's a lot closer. It would take just 9 minutes. And were they to be placed in Ukraine, and you can see why the Russians were so bothered about this, look at that, look at the, if you can, the border between Ukraine and Russia. 7 minutes, okay? Now, we're not talking about the hypersonic missiles, which, as you know, you'll remember me saying 5 minutes, okay? Again, these installations are already in place in Romania and Poland. They're capped, so the Russians, nobody can figure out what kind of missiles are in those capsules, which can accommodate not only ABM, but cruise missiles and eventually hypersonic missiles. Now, I want to make an analogy here because I think it will help you to understand. May we have the next slide, please? Exactly 61 years ago, and I know this personally because it was when I went on active duty as an Army intelligence infantry officer at Fort Benning, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. At Fort Benning, the Army Infantry Training Center, there were no weapons. Where were those weapons? They were in Key West, okay? We were all ready to invade Cuba. Kennedy found out just about this time, this week, 61 years ago, whoops, here's the CIA telling him that there were operational SS-4 missiles, okay? SS-4 missiles. Now, look at the circle in the middle. The shorter circle is just has to do with bombers. The missiles are the key here. That circle there that's in the middle, that shows SS-4s, okay? Now, they were already in place in Cuba. They were already primed with nuclear warheads. We weren't sure at the time, but we know now. And you look at the 12 minutes to Washington. How long? Well, you could Dallas, the naval ports of Norfolk and Savannah, okay? Now, the next missiles that were due to arrive in Cuba, they were the SS-5s. Now, they would take longer, 19 minutes, but they never got there. Why? Because Kennedy put in a blockade. Now, blockades are illegal under international law, so he called it a quarantine, but a quarantine is a blockade, right? Okay? And he said, okay, no more Soviet ships delivering missiles to Cuba. Whoa, what happened? Thank God. What happened? Anybody know? Yeah.
Cuban Missile Crisis.
They stopped.
In 1962, and the Russians pulled back.
Right. Okay, the Russians stopped. And the SS-5 missiles, that outer concentric circle, never got through the... Look at the lower left-hand corner of this slide. You'll see those blue ships. Those are the good guys. That's the blockade, right? Those SS-5s never got to Cuba. Now, what's the point here? The point here is that when a major power like the United States or Russia feels an existential threat, 5 minutes, hypersonic missiles, or in the old days, 61 years ago, 9 minutes, 12 minutes, they do what's necessary to remove the existential threat. Thank God, Khrushchev looked at his advisors and said, oh, the equivalent of SHIT in Russian, okay? And he said, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was a good try, but this is not an existential threat for us. Kennedy believes it's one for him. Let's get the hell out of Dodge, which they did. Now, I remember those times quite vividly. I don't remember anybody saying, wait a second, JFK. You can't do illegal things. My God. Quarantine? Come on, that's a blockade. That's illegal. And every nation has the sovereign right to pick its allies. So if Cuba wants to have Soviet missiles in Cuba, who are you to object? That's illegal too. And threatening nuclear war and preparing an invasion. What are you doing, JFK? Do any of you with the same color hair that I have remember any Americans saying that? No. Okay. Well, all right, they didn't say that, okay? Now, what am I referring to? I'm referring to the analogy here, okay? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. The Russians have been warning for 8-9 years now that Ukraine and NATO would be an existential threat. I already referred to that one conversation where Bill Burns, our ambassador in Moscow, reported back, "Niet means niet," Russia's red lines, and we violated those red lines. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer, but I do want to sort of cite a person who is the dean of what has been called the realistic school of political science. Now, some of you professors will know about what other schools there may be. I'm afraid to ask. I mean, realistic school, I can buy into that. I mean, that's what I did for 27 years in the CIA. I was a glorified analyst, right? I was a glorified journalist. I had access to all manner of other sources, but it was the press and what the Russians were saying that was the real gravy, which I drank. So when we talk about what you can know about these things, you can know an awful lot. And what John Mearsheimer, the prime exponent of the, do we have Mearsheimer up here on the thing? We have the next slide, please. Is he up here? Yeah, good. Okay, now this is 9 years ago, folks, 9 years plus. John Mearsheimer had been watching this stuff really closely, and he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, the prestigious foreign policy journal. And the title of it was, "Why Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault." Okay, the U.S. and NATO now face a choice on Ukraine. They can exacerbate hostilities with Russia and devastate Ukraine. I repeat, and devastate Ukraine, those poor people. Or U.S. and NATO can work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine. Oh, wait a second. Did I say that there was a deal? Yeah, there was a deal. Late March, early April, right after the invasion, where the Russians made it clear, look, we want a deal. And Kiev said, well, sounds good to us. And they got together first in Belarus, then in Turkey, had a deal. I mentioned that before. It involved basically Ukrainian neutrality and a ceasefire. And we have that from all manner of sources, including a lot of Russophobes. So this is what Putin said just last May at a major conference. He said, look, Putin invaded Ukraine with great reluctance. I don't think he had any other options. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement so that he would not have to invade. Now, Aaron Matei talked about the Minsk agreement last time he was here. In a word, this was a way in which the Russians felt diddled. Reasonably, they felt diddled because Germany and Paris, Germany and France, at the U.S. behest, kept these negotiations going, which was supposed to provide for a ceasefire against Donbass and a degree of regional autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk. And they were diddled. Now, how do I know they were diddled? Because Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and François Hollande, the head of France, admitted it, bragged about it, said, no, we just kept these negotiations going so that we would buy time for Ukraine to get rearmed. And look how well they're rearmed now. And indeed, they were well rearmed in 8 years. So that's the Minsk agreement. I don't want to pay a lot of attention to that, but it really, was that another broken promise? Well, okay. Let me finish with this. A lot of people have been accused of saying, you're in Putin's pocket if you suggest that the reason for the invasion of Ukraine was the enlargement of NATO. That's what the Russians say, for God's sake. You know, how can you say the same things that the Russians say? Well, I have a little news for you. After all that disparaging of those of us who stick to the facts, the Secretary General of NATO made a faux pas grande, if I may, just about 5 weeks ago. And this is what he said. His name is Jens Stoltenberg, and he said this: He was speaking to the EU Parliament. And he said, the background of all this is that President Putin, this is a direct quote now, in the autumn of 2021, actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. It was a precondition for not invading Ukraine.
It is the case that for the entire time that NATO enlargement was going on, right, there was this world of people who were talking about the fact, including Kenneth, saying this is really dangerous, this is really crazy, this is really provocative. There were people saying that, not a few people, a lot of people, but most Americans, including probably people in this room, weren't thinking about it at all because you have a lot of other things to think about. So, you know, then when this thing heats up and Russia invades, I think a lot of people feel, oh, this is just an excuse. People who are talking about NATO, they're just bringing it up, but, you know, as an excuse. It's nothing to do with NATO, as you just saw there. It's really because Putin simply wants to take over Europe, right? But there's a real issue and a serious issue here that really still needs to be addressed, which is when we take military steps or build up our nuclear arsenal or strengthen our military alliances, does that make us safer or does that put us in greater danger? I think that's really the question that Ray's remarks are. And so I'm going to be quiet now and ask Ray, how do we get out of this? And now I disappear. Your notes to safely escape. No, not quite.
Sorry. See what I mean? But I can speak Russian. You know? Kick people in the head, but I can speak Russian. Okay, just to pick up on a couple of things that Carolyn said here. NATO, it was formed, as was said, 6 years before the Warsaw Pact. Lord Ismay from the United Kingdom defined its purpose. It was very simple. It was to keep, with respect to Europe, keep the United States in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Whoa. Now, that's my time. I went through those times. I thought it was a really good idea to keep the Americans in, Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the question was, well, should we rehabilitate the Germans? I mean, should we reunite Germany? And when I heard this being discussed, you know, maybe I saw too many war movies, but it scared the hell out of me. Reunited Germany? Now, as I said, the U.S. suffered 420,000 killed in World War II. The Russians, 26,000. So, you know, I'm not Gorbachev. I'm not Shevardnadze, the foreign minister. How did they feel about the notion of a reunited Germany? Well, that was a distasteful quid, and they asked what the quo was. Quid pro quo, and the quo was we wouldn't move NATO 1 inch to the east. Before you knew it, NATO had doubled in size, all of the new countries well beyond 1 inch to the east of the German border. Now, not only that, how many Soviet troops were in East Germany? Anybody remember?
24 divisions.
Yeah, right. About 300,000, 350,000 troops. Were provisions made for those troops? No, they were just told to withdraw, and they bivouacked on fields in Russia with no preparations, and they got no reimbursement. In other words, Gorbachev, who did this deal, is a very unpopular person in Russia now because they say you were taken in, you know. Look, they moved. They're double the size east of Germany, and we had to go through that big expense. And of course, the real indignity was when Yeltsin came in and the oligarchs from East and West, the Harvard boys and the Department of Commerce, plundered the Russian natural resources to the point where, well, here's one statistic to show you how the Russians suffered. World Bank figures, folks, between 1991 and 1995, Yeltsin years, the average age at which a Russian male died went from 73 to 67. I don't know about you, but that speaks volumes to me. And it was Putin that had to pick up the pieces on that. The only thing will I say anymore? I won't say anymore, except that, oh yeah. When the Soviet Union imploded, what happened to the Warsaw Pact? Anybody know? Anybody? Yeah.
Yes. What happened was Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, I already mentioned that, all joined NATO.
Yeah, okay. This is farther than I wanted to go. I just wanted to say that the Warsaw Pact folded and was disbanded, but worse still, as Jay has just told me, most of those members became members of NATO, for God's sake. So they were the ones that doubled the size of NATO. So, was that? Well, there are a couple of reasons why the U.S. decided to do this. One was crass political motives. Bill Clinton wanted to win the election against Doerr, and he needed those Midwestern states that had heavy East European populations. And Jack Matlock, who's a friend of mine, previous ambassador to Russia and early Soviet Union, told me, look, Ray, I testified. I told them what a danger would be. And I was pulled aside by staffers after, and they said, look, we agree completely with you, but the decision is made. We have to win this election. Now, that's how it goes, okay? That's how it goes in foreign policy decision-making in our country. But the point I wanted to make is simply that the Warsaw Pact did not only implode, but it joined NATO, okay? And so, how was a Russian leader to look at that? Well, if you put it in historic circumstances, you know how we look at that. And what I'm trying to do here is what I did for 27 years at the CIA, put myself in the shoes of the Kremlin leaders, okay? And to the degree people want to say I'm in Putin's pocket, well, I did just deduce the facts, documented facts, and say, all right, well, if you still think so, that's your opinion. And this is really telling. The last thing I'll say. I gave a rather long lecture on this comparison between the Cuban Missile Crisis and those offensive strike weapons in Romania and Poland. It was up in Massachusetts. Now, after that was over, one of the commenters said, McGovern, I'm sick of him. He's trying to justify what the Russians did in Ukraine. Luckily, a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist responded to that. And he said, I listened to what McGovern said, and then I watched it again. He never said justified. He never said anything like that. But the facts that he adduced apparently convinced you, commenter, that the invasion was justified. It's sort of on you. It's your interpretations. If that's what the facts tell you, so don't say McGovern justified it. And just a word here, this is hard for people to understand, but intelligence analysts don't justify, they don't make moral judgments, they serve up the facts, okay, and leave the policymakers, and in this case, you all, to decide who has the merits of the argument. It's not a matter of justifying, it's a matter of setting out the facts and trying to figure out how the Russians are looking at this. Sorry for this long diversion. Yeah, what's up?
You didn't answer one of the basic questions. How would you bring about an end to the war?
Oh, how to bring about an end to the war. Well, okay, number one, factoid, okay? And this, again, is on the final back there. Even though our president said 2 months ago, Russia has already lost the war, he could not have been farther off the mark. Russia has already won the war. Now, if that puts me in Putin's pocket, so be it. Those are the facts. The Ukrainians are almost down to their last person. Remember that adage, the Ukraine will fight till the last Ukrainian? We're really happy about that. We're developing weapons and so forth and getting good practice there with the Ukrainians. But they're out of people and they're out of ammunition. And I have never seen the like of the miserable performance of the U.S. intelligence community, with the Director of National Intelligence saying at the early part of this year, I'm really optimistic about the chances for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because, you know, the Russians are running out of ammunition, and the Russians have no indigenous capability to produce this information. That's what she said. Her name is Avril Haines. Now, she got mixed up. It's just the opposite, okay? It's the U.S., it's NATO, it's Ukraine that's out of ammunition. And what ammunition? These 155 millimeter shells. Now, they've been with the U.S. Army for as long as I've been around, okay? I practiced with them in Fort Benning when we finally got those howitzers and artillery pieces back, okay, from Key West, okay? 155 millimeter shells. Now, so we ran out of them. Ran out of them about 2 months ago. Biden's advisors, Mr. President, Ukraine's out of those 155 shells. They've been shooting them off like crazy. Well, we'll give them some of ours. Oh, Mr. President, we're real low ourselves. We can't. How about NATO? No, NATO doesn't have any either. Okay. Well, you know, the solution to that was cluster ammunitions. I'm not going to go into that, but I will say to this: if Russia was a big threat to Europe, don't you think that NATO and the U.S. would have provided enough shells for the basic artillery and tank shells, 155 millimeter ammunition? Well, you know, I don't know how you figure this out, but either Russia wasn't a big threat and wasn't perceived as a big threat, at least not until the coup in Ukraine, or these people are completely incompetent and don't know how to plan for any kind of military operation. So that's really important. If you need proof that NATO did not consider Russia a threat, then just think about the implications of NATO not providing for the basic shells for 155 millimeter howitzers and artillery pieces. I think that throws some light on that question. Sorry to be so long here. Carolyn, are you going to take more questions, or should I just, anyone, please.
I got a question for Professor Eisenberg.
Oh, wait, is there a mic that could go around? Oh.
I think one other factor involved with the creation of NATO was that there was, after World War II, a study done by the Army of U.S. industry, which was very dependent on the military. And there was great concern that we were going to go through a depression after the war. I don't have a site for that study. I've read the study. If you Google it, you're going to have great difficulty finding it. There's a book that followed up by Frank Kosky, and that's one that's well documented. His documentation is good. The aircraft industry in California was going to go bust. And so they needed to create a threat. And this is, and basically, if you read that book, you will see how the policy makers created a Soviet threat that did not exist at that time. And then with regard to Germany, after the war, even though the Morgenthau Plan was rejected, U.S. occupation forces under a JCS memo was they treated the German population very, very very brutally, and they were, for example, preventing food aid from going in. The Red Cross couldn't go in. There's a book by James Bach, 2 books by James Bach.
Middle East over the last week or so, it was Russia's fault, but you know, there are limits to Russian influence. Russia has influence in Syria now, and that's a powder keg too, because we have forces in Syria that were really not invited, and the Russians have forces in Syria that really were invited, and the Syrian regime seems to be sort of persisting and in power. So it's a powder keg, but I'd be really careful about charges that Russia is funding people like Hamas. Hamas probably gets a lot of stuff from Iran and from others, but I don't know where they get, but they're getting a lot of stuff from Ukraine. Have you seen the reports? The weapons that they've picked up have been diverted from places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, the U.S. manufactured weapons. My God, so, it's really complicated. Thanks for your question. Does that do it?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
I just, curious of what your thought was.
Yeah.
That's all.
30 seconds. Only. Who said no? Don't chicken out. Who said no?
If you're not paying tuition, we are a little strict.
Okay. No. Okay. I believe your conflation between the Cuban Missile Crisis and what is going on now with Ukraine is dubious. That was the Cold War, where both nations during the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So you now have a fascist dictator in the Soviet Union, in Russia, launching an attack against Ukraine, calling the Ukrainians Nazis, which is a lie. The audience here doesn't know that Putin gained power in 1999 through lies about bombings in apartments in Moscow, and that is off the charts here completely, I understand. However, that's part of the discussion you didn't bring up.
Your question, Jay?
My question is, I believe some of your arguments are dubious. Why?
So this could be a really interesting post-event conversation. But I really, because students particularly not only need to get to classes, have gone to classes. So I just want to thank Ray before any more private conversations for this very provocative and I think deeper dive into the origins of Silicon Valley. We've still left on the table what we do about it, and Professor Eisenberg's very important question, but we'll save that, we'll work on that for another session. But please join me for thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Remember also the Day of Dialogue, October 25th. Lots of stuff going on that day.
A Canadian journalist who worked with, I think, Edwin Fisher, who was an Army historian, that basically documents that. And they were worried that Germany was there was an uprising. The unions they were worried that Germany was going to go communist. So they started the Marshall Plan. They had NATO. And they also were able to reinvigorate U.S. industry. Mm-hmm. You can disagree with it. Those are facts, though, that are outlined in the Koski book. The Koski book you can get. And I would urge...
Well, thanks for that, Ed. Next questioner, please.
Okay, I wanted to make a
could you speak right into the microphone?
I wanted to make a quick comment and
Sure.
then go to your question, the question regarding you. Professor Eisenberg, you were talking about the origination of NATO. Well, we have to go back a little bit before the end of World War II, when the British and the Americans were negotiating with the Russians to be sure that Poland had self-determination as far as their government. because there was a government in exile from before World War II in London. Well, that never happened. The Russians obviously occupied all of Poland and turned it into a communist state. They did the same thing with Hungary. They did the same thing, incursions into even Austria, incursions into Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, etc., Romania. These were nations that were part of...
Jay, we need your question.
Okay, so there's a question about what you stated before, Professor. Now, as far as the questions to you, okay. You mentioned...
I'm hard of hearing. Speak right in.
As far as no NATO enlargement.
Yeah.
Okay. And I already mentioned, what about Poland and Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We had shelling, as you said, artillery shelling at the border between Russia and Ukraine back in 2014.
In the Donbass, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The Donbass, so Donetsk and Luhansk declared themselves people's republics.
Right.
And they allied themselves with the Russians.
Yeah.
And the Russians moved in, and there was what the conflict was about, in addition to Crimea in 2014.
Okay. Well, the real story on that, Jay, is that these guys in Donetsk and Lugansk, almost all Russian, well, heavily Russian speakers, didn't want to accept the coup regime in Kiev of February 2014 any more than the Crimeans did, okay? Now, the Crimeans had a real ace in the hole. What was that? That was Sevastopol, the only all-weather, all-year-round naval base in Russia, okay? Created during Catherine the Great, for God's sake, at the time of our revolution, okay? The basic naval base, okay? So, you know, if NATO thought that they would take over that NATO base, well, they weren't going to do that. So that's why they had the plebiscite in Crimea. That's why Crimea was annexed. Now, the point is here, Donetsk and Lugansk said, oh, please annex us too, please. Would you please annex us too? And Putin said, no. And they said, why? And that's when Putin said, because of Minsk. We're dealing with these wonderful people, these Germans and these French, and we're dealing with people representing Donetsk and Lugansk, and we're going to deal with the Ukrainian government. We're going to work this out. We're going to keep plugging away so that these republics can have a reasonable degree of autonomy. And it didn't happen. What happened? Now, Merkel and Hollande admit this was a diddling process. We just needed to buy time for NATO to arm the Ukrainian army into the most powerful army in Europe, next to the Russian army. So, the whole thing is pretty distasteful. But that's the way it went down. And when Putin said, "Look, we're finally going to recognize Lugansk and Donetsk, and we should have done this a long time ago." Whoa, that's what he said. Now, you can imagine there are a lot of people backbiting behind Putin saying, why the hell did you do this when there was no Ukrainian army, for God's sake? You trusted the West, just like Gorbachev trusted the West. What are you going to learn? That's why it's going to be really, really hard to have a peace agreement of any real strength. In answer to the question here, and I'm sorry to be so long-winded, there's not going to be any peace negotiations until the United States recognizes it has a choice between escalating to nuclear weapons. Wake up back there, it's on a final, okay? Between escalating to nuclear weapons or finally doing a deal which leaves large parts of Ukraine under Russian control. That's what scares me.
I want to make sure students have a chance.
Yeah.
They're paying the tuition, so.
Yeah, and we want a woman student first. A woman student. We have to be a little gender equal here. Okay. All right. We won't be sexist here.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not a female, but
That's okay.
And I do apologize. My question will not be as scholarly as everyone else's, but
Good.
I'm just confused because from this presentation, what I learned is in every step of the way between the communications of America and Russia and NATO and the Soviets as well as with Ukraine, America did every wrong step, continued escalating this, and I don't see any. I don't see America being condemned in the media or by political commentators, by politicians, or even by the president admitting himself. So I'm just confused. Did America not do a bad thing? Because from what I heard, it seems like they did many terrible things.
Yeah.
And Russia was only perfecting itself.
This is a great question. The answer is pretty simple. If you rely on the major media, you don't get much of the story at all. Now, were we completely to blame? Of course not. There was a Soviet Union. They did threaten us. I mean, I spent my career making sure that the policymakers knew what I thought they were doing. And when they were finally coming around to say, let's have arms control, I was part of that ABM treaty, which gave stability for 3 decades, okay, until Junior Bush got out of them. So there were real threats. Whether they were threats because of perceived threats on the other side, well, that doesn't really matter. There were real threats. So it's not like anybody is saying the Russians are pure innocents and the West. It's more complicated, but the facts matter, and the facts have not been adduced in the major media.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Next, please. Whoops, no women? Come on, we need a woman up there. Oh, that's not this. Okay. All right. I'm thinking that, it'd be nice to have a little balance here. And most of the people here have been of male. So if any women want to be incentivized, there's a prize of a cup of coffee toward the end here after these next 2 questioners. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Let me start by asking you this. Are you familiar with the acronym BRICS?
BRICS, of course, yeah.
Do you think that the Western response towards Ukraine and the Russians feeling so pressured has led them to seek stronger ties with BRICS and BRICS as a whole?
Yes, and that's a key question. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Okay, these people have been together now for about 7-8 years. And they are the alternative to some of these Western-dominated gang of 7 or gang of 8, or they don't call them gang, but and they are accruing more power as we speak. And the big thing, of course, you have Russia and China, Brazil. These countries have a lot of people in them. So that is the alternative, and that is the State Department people are losing the advantage there by these people turning more and more to China and the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. So that's a good question. Look it up, folks, BRICS. Even Google will have a fairly decent portrayal of what that's about. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Follow the money. Mention something about that.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for coming. I, more than others, might be a little susceptible to believing that the expansion of NATO was the end-all be-all of Russia's invasion. But I'm wondering, I think something that hasn't been touched on is why Russia wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. I think that, at least to me, it seems a little dubious that it represents a sincere security threat to Russia. And I'm wondering whether you can speak to that at all, whether you think that the security threat that you mentioned of an expanding NATO and closer to Russia's borders is really an actual security threat, or whether that's just an excuse that they used.
That's a really good question. How do I answer it? Well, I think I've demonstrated that in a very matter-of-fact, on-the-ground situation, you have the equivalent of Soviet missiles in Cuba, right on Russia's border. NATO is a military alliance. When the Soviet Union fell apart and the Warsaw Pact fell apart, why did NATO not fall apart? Putin and others made overtures to the West. Putin suggested, hey, let us join NATO. He was proceeding on the understanding that, you know, what George H.W. Bush said, a Europe free and complete from Lisbon to Vladivostok, that was a possibility. Why not? You know, well, there were interests involved here. Ed referred to corporate and what I call the Mickey Mat, you know, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. It's in the dictionary now. Look it up. Mickey Mat rhymes with Mickey Mouse, so you can remember it. It's what Eisenhower warned about. The military-industrial complex. It's grown like Topsy now. It includes the Congress. It includes the media. Who owns the media? The people who make the arms. I don't usually quote the Pope. But the Pope stepped up to the plate in Congress in 2015, okay? And he looked out at these senators and representatives and said, you know, the main problem in the world are the blood-drenched arms traders. And the representatives and the senators got up of a person and then they looked in their pocket to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed had fallen out. And, oh, here's the one from Raytheon, you know. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. They're all bought and sold, folks. You know? They're all depending on contributions and stuff from the people who build and sell the arms. I don't always agree with the Pope, but he got this one right, okay? And the exhibition that was given was sort of you know, kind of telling, it seemed to me. So that's part of it. The Mickey Mat and media I usually put in caps because without the media you can't do it. And Eisenhower didn't mention the media because the media wasn't owned by the rest of the Mickey Mat when Eisenhower made that wonderful speech.
Got time for one more question before we wrap up?
Thank you.
Oh, good.
This is a little bit off, but I was just curious whether you think there's any connection with the Russians supplying Hamas with weapons or money in view of the fact of what's going on, just the fear that the U.S. is going to be split between supplying Ukraine and supplying Israel.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't heard of the Russians supplying weapons to Hamas.
How about money?
I haven't heard money to Hamas either. But if you have sources on that, I'd love to have them.
Okay.
No, it's. I mean, the Russians have been accused of lots of stuff. Who was it that accused them of? Well, Zelensky said all the troubles in